I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You know, you read what others had done, and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you patented it and packaged it and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You want to sell it. Well,
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
In many ways, the ending of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet was a pretty big departure from what the series had seen before. This is the first time we've ever seen the professor of a game serve the role of the antagonist. And it makes for a very, very satisfying ending, albeit one that's maybe a little bit tragic when you learn the truth about what happened in Area Zero. For those of you who maybe haven't touched the game since November, I'm going to briefly sort of remind you as to what exactly the plot was of that section of the game. And it's here where you learn some pretty big twists about the game that starts to answer some of the questions, like why does the professor only communicate with you via phone call? Well, it's because the professor isn't really the professor. They're an AI construct filled with the professor's memories. And what we learn is that the professor was researching time travel, i.e. trying to bring Pokemon either from the past or from the future to the present day so that they could live with the citizens of Paldea. And eventually, as the professor kept using the time machine, one of the Pokemon that came back was a little less than friendly. And ultimately, the professor ended up giving their life in order to save the Pokemon that was originally brought to the present. That being either the Koraidon or Miraidon that accompanies you for most of the game. And since the professor's death, the AI has sort of continued the work, but has realized that maybe it's a bad idea to keep the time machine going, as these Pokemon, not being from the present day, might disrupt the natural ecosystems of the Paldea region. And so, they enlist your help to destroy it, as they are programmed to protect the time machine at all costs. Ultimately, in the end, the player succeeds, with the AI sending themselves to either the past or the future, allowing the time machine to be shut down, and thus averting a potential ecological crisis. And while this makes for a fairly strong ending, it's not necessarily a completely original idea now.
Boy, do I hate being right all the time.
So I probably don't need to do too much to introduce this story, as it's easily one of the best movies ever made and is just an incredible watch from start to finish, but I think it is worth acknowledging the similarities between the story of Jurassic Park and that of the ending of this game. Because there are a lot of similarities, and you can pull away a bit of a similar warning from the two. However, in looking at Jurassic Park, I realized that maybe the movie isn't necessarily the place to look at. Perhaps I should look at the book instead. And part of that reasoning is that while the movie is a very, very well put together movie, it does tone down some of the darker elements and dulls a bit of the more cautionary tale aspects of the original book. And so while most of you are probably only familiar with the movie, I'm going to draw more from the Jurassic Park book than I am from the film, because some of those aforementioned differences make it much more interesting to look at. Beyond just the parallels, there's one other reason that I want to take a look at this particular topic. That being the fact that seemingly we seem to be drawing closer and closer to that book not being science fiction, with scientists already toying the idea of cloning animals like the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger, as well as eccentric billionaires tweeting that we should make a real-life Jurassic Park. Like, how do you miss the point of the story this badly? Like, you don't come away from the story thinking, yeah, that's awesome, we should do that. And so we're going to use different cues from these stories to sort of remind ourselves why maybe this isn't the best idea. And so, without further ado, let's begin. So the first element of these two stories that I want to look at that highlights why maybe we shouldn't do this is the risk of creatures getting out. And while the movie goes from that opening scene with the raptor attack to getting the characters on the island fairly quickly, the book takes a bit of a different approach. The book actually takes a little while and instead opens with a scene with a completely unrelated family vacationing on the beach, where a little girl wanders off and eventually gets bitten by a strange lizard that is similar but doesn't quite match the description of any of the local wildlife. Following the bite, the girl has an adverse reaction and is rushed to the hospital, where doctors are playing it down to sort of, calm the parents down and saying that it's just a common lizard and that it's an allergic reaction and that there's nothing really to worry about. Well then, Dr. Gutierrez said, I know the lizard. He explained that of the 6,000 species of lizards in the world, no more than 24 walked upright. Of those species, only 4 were found in Latin America, and judging by the coloration, the lizard could only be one of the 4. I am sure this lizard was a Basiliscus amaranthus, a striped basilisk lizard, found here in Costa Rica, and also in Honduras. Standing on their hind legs, they are sometimes as tall as a foot. Are they poisonous? No, Mrs. Bowman, not at all, Gutierrez explained that the swelling in Tina's arm was an allergic reaction. According to the literature, 14% of people are strongly allergic to reptiles, he said. And your daughter seems to be one of them. And it's here that we see that the characters are very quick to then completely dismiss any of the differences between the basilisk lizard and the drawing the girl made, even at the insistence of her parents that she is quite good at drawing. However, the book does highlight some of those differences from the perspective of some of the other scientists. In the modern laboratory in the basement of the Clínica Santa Maria, word was received that Dr. Gutierrez had identified the animal that had bitten the American child as a harmless basilisk lizard. Immediately, the analysis of the saliva was halted, even though a preliminary fracturization showed several extremely high molecular weight proteins of unknown biological activity. But the night technician was busy, and he placed the saliva samples on the holding shelf of the refrigerator. And it goes on for a little while with a bunch of minor characters sort of passing this information around, until it eventually makes it to one of our main characters, Dr. Alan Grant, who immediately identifies the sketch of an animal as a dinosaur. The type of dinosaur that identified is what the book later refers to as a compy, and the designation of that particular animal is particularly noteworthy, as we'll see as we get later on into the video. Meanwhile, Scarlet and Violet have a bit of a different approach, showing the perspective of either Coridon or Miraidon crash landing on a beach near the player's starting area. And so the takeaway here is a bit different. In this particular sequence, it's clear that something happened to this Pokemon, but it isn't 100% made known yet what exactly it was. It's just identified that this particular Pokemon was injured in some manner, and the game keeps us in the dark for a long time, not really hinting as to what was going on in Area Zero. As Arvin notes, the professor was rather secretive, which is something that we will definitely get to in due time. There is one other major instance of a Paradox Pokemon getting out of Area Zero, that being the case of the Quaking Earth Titan, either a Great Tusk or an Iron Treads depending on which game you're playing. This is the first time that you ever encounter a Paradox Pokemon in the game, and it's one of those moments where you're sort of like, what is this? Like, it looks like a Donphan, but it clearly isn't. And so the game story is sort of more just dropping breadcrumbs than immediately sort of maybe raising the red flags of the potential dangers here. The game also doesn't really do too much to explain how Pokemon are kept from getting out, or how these particular two manage to do so. Well, in the case of Miraidon, it's fairly obvious that the Pokemon can actually fly, but the case of this, not a Donphan, but technically is a Donphan, is a little more unclear, so to speak. Meanwhile, Jurassic Park very clearly shows how some of these creatures got out. That is, that there are supply ships coming to and from the mainland, and a few have gotten out of the holding pens and have sort of stowed away on these boats. Actually, a major plot point of the book that is completely absent from the movie is that when using the night vision binoculars, Tim, that's the little boy, sees a ship with a couple of young velociraptors getting on board. And so one of the things that the plot focuses on is that him, Dr. Grant, and his sister getting back before that boat reaches the mainland. However, when you look at the interactions of some of the characters who run the park, they're pretty overconfident that they've got the situation under lock. There are several things that both the movie and the book explain keep the dinosaurs in place. One explanation they give is that the dinosaurs are dependent on the amino acid lysine, which they have to get from the food produced by the park. Thus, if any were to get off the island, which they're very confident that that wouldn't happen, they would die within 24 hours. However, we'll explain that that's a bit less of an issue than we might first think. The second thing they explain is that there is not only a highly electrified fence that keep the dinosaurs in their holding pens, but also a motion tracking system which keeps tabs on all of the dinosaurs at all times. And thus they know with a pretty reasonable degree of certainty where these creatures are at any given time. However, as you might suspect, there are some issues with this system that become fairly apparent early on. The first thing they note is that the sensors don't have 100% coverage of the entire area. There are sections of the park that the animals can get into that won't cause the motion sensors to pick them up. The second is a bit of a limitation with the dinosaurs. One major plot element in both parts of the story is that these animals are all female. The book also adds that they were irradiated, but then they also immediately raise the concern that we can't say for certain that radiation will actually sterilize these creatures. And because of this assumption that the animals are not breeding, it becomes a case of where they very quickly come to assume things that aren't exactly true. I'm about to read a scene from the book at about the point right before everything goes to shit. To sort of set the scene for you, the characters have gotten out of the vehicles and are talking with Harding, the veterinarian, where Grant discovers what looks to be the remains of an eggshell. And at this point, they are talking remotely to the people in the control room. Absolutely absurd, Hammond said in the control room, listening to the report over the radio. It must be a bird egg, that's all it can be, the radio crackled. He heard Malcolm's voice. Let's do a little test, shall we? Ask Mr. Arnold to run one of his computer tallies. Now? Yes, right now. I understand you can transmit it to the screen in Dr. Harding's car. Do that too, will you? No problem, Arnold said. A moment later, the screen in the control room printed out. I hope you're satisfied, Hammond said. Are you receiving it down there on your screen? We see it, Malcolm said. Everything accounted for, as always. He couldn't keep the satisfaction out of his voice. Now then, Malcolm said, can you have the computer search for a different number of animals? Like what? Arnold said. Try 239. Just a minute, Arnold said, frowning. A moment later, the screen printed. Hammond sat forward. What the hell is that? We picked up another copy. From where? I don't know. The radio crackled. Now then, can you ask your computer to search for, let's say, 300 animals? What is he talking about? Hammond said, his voice raising. 300 animals? What's he talking about? Just a minute, Arnold said. That'll take a few minutes. He punched the button on the screens, and the first line of totals appeared. Total animals, 339. I don't understand what he's driving at, Hammond said. I'm afraid I do, Arnold said. He watched the screen. The numbers in the first line were clicking. Total animals, 244. 244, Hammond said. What's going on? The computer is counting the animals in the park, Wu said. All the animals. I thought that's what it's always did, he spun. Nedry, have you screwed up again? No, Nedry said, looking up from his console. The computer allows the operator to enter an expected number of animals in order to make the counting process faster. But it's a convenience, not a flaw. He's right, Arnold said. We always use the base count of 238 because we assumed there couldn't be more. Total animals, 262. Wait a minute, Hammond said. These animals can't breed. The computer must be counting field mice or something. I think so too, Arnold said. It's almost certainly an error in the visual tracking. But we'll know soon enough. Hammond turned to Wu. They can't breed, can they? No, Wu said. Total animals, 270. Where are they coming from, Arnold said. Damned if I know, Wu said. They watched the number climb. 283. Over the radio, they heard Geronimo say, holy shit, how much more? And then they heard a girl say, I'm getting hungry, when are we going home? Pretty soon, Lex. On the screen, there was a flashing error. Error, search params, 300 animals, not found. An error, Hammond said. I thought so. I had a feeling all along there must be an error. But a moment later, the screen printed. The radio crackled. Now you see the flaw in your procedures, Malcolm said. You only tracked the expected number of dinosaurs. You were worried about losing animals, and your procedures were designed to advise you instantly if you had less than the expected number. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that you had more than the expected number. The book then goes on to run a couple more metrics, and they look at some graphs with some Gaussian distributions that are indicative of a breeding population. But that's not necessarily what's important here. It's that since the system was undercounting, it would not pick up if, say, a dinosaur had gotten out. And it's throughout the story of Jurassic Park that these negative externalities are sort of explored. This is something that is almost completely absent from the story of Scarlet and Violet. We still do see the same level of pride from the characters, though. As the professor notes in the third journal entry, I'm so close to creating a world like one in the book, a paradise where we three can live happily together forever. I must make it real. And as we note, pride comes before a fall. In the case of the professor, as we've already gone over, they eventually get attacked by one of the Pokemon that they brought into Area Zero. Meanwhile, in the book, it's a bit more of a complicated process. So one of the things that frames the story a lot, that the movie tones down significantly, is the emphasis on the mathematical idea of chaos theory. And I, for one, will not pretend, even after reading this book, to understand what exactly it means, but the book very much draws our attention to the idea that with uncertainty comes inherent instability within systems. And so this idea of either bringing Pokemon into the present via a time machine, or cloning previously extinct animals and trying to control them in sort of a zoo-like environment is ultimately going to go south. In fact, the whole point of Ian Malcolm, aka Jeff Goldblum's character, is that he was hired to mathematically model the park, and his conclusion was that, based on his simulation, the park was going to fail, that it was inevitable. And that's what makes this technology so dangerous, is that ultimately you can't say for certain what's going to happen. In particular, the case of Jurassic Park is to bring back to that topic of the dinosaurs breeding, is what the characters eventually discover and state in both versions of the story is that they use the DNA of frogs. In the book, though, it's only a select subset, notably the subset that are breeding. And as the story explains, some species of frog have a very unique property amongst certain members of the animal kingdom. They are able to spontaneously change their sex, in this particular case from female to male, in the presence of a single-sex environment. And so, since all the animals in the park were female, that frog DNA caused some of them to become male, thus allowing for breeding. It also explains why things like the lysine dependency are maybe not 100% of a guarantee, because that's a trait that, if they're naturally breeding, can be bred out just as the generations go on and genes are randomly selected. It's all simply the roll of the dice. And it's one of those things that the story is very explicit in explaining, that DNA is so long that a human cannot look over all of it, let alone intuit the meaning of anything contained within. At the end of the day, when you trust technology more and more, the more likely it is to have certain errors that might be missed if a human were to be, say, double-checking it. And this is something that we see very strongly in the case of both stories, actually. In the case of Jurassic Park, we see that they're trying to run the park entirely from a singular control room with, like, 30 people, which, admirable, that's like what any company wants to do, which is to automate as much of their processes and employ as few people as possible. However, the design of their particular system creates what we might refer to as a single point of failure. Everything is controlled from this one main computer. So if that computer goes out or has some sort of bug, all it takes is, say, one incompetent employee, or in our particular case, one disgruntled employee trying to go all scorched earth on his way out to derail the entire thing. There's also a line in the book that I found absolutely hilarious, is that when Arnold is going over the code to sort of figure out what exactly Nendry did to sabotage the system, he notes that it's not only 2 million lines long, but mostly undocumented, which, relatable. However, going back to the professor's death, there's an interesting parallel between that and some of the events of this particular story. As we learn very quickly, the animals are quite dangerous and do not seem to be okay with just being zoo exhibits. And I'm going to read a small section from the end of the book. This is, again, a scene that is completely absent from the movie. In the lodge, John Hammond paced back and forth in Malcolm's room. Hammond was impatient and uncomfortable. Since marshaling the effort for his last outburst, Malcolm had slipped into a coma, and now it appeared to Hammond that he might actually die. Of course, a helicopter had been sent for, but God knows when it would arrive. The thought that Malcolm might die in the meantime filled Hammond with anxiety and dread. And paradoxically, Hammond found it all much worse because he disliked the mathematician so much. It was worse than if the man were his friend. Hammond felt like Malcolm's death, should it occur, would be the final rebuke. And that was more than Hammond could bear. We're going to skip forward a bit, but what you need to know is that he steps out for fresh air and is going to return to his personal residence on the island. He went through the gates of the fence, looking around the park. It was late afternoon, the time when the blowing mist was thinned, and the sun sometimes came out. The sun was out now, and Hammond took it as an omen. Say what they would, he knew his park had promise, even if that impetuous fool Geronimo decided to burn it to the ground. it would not make much of a difference. Hammond knew that in 2 separate vaults in InGen headquarters in Palo Alto were dozens of frozen embryos. It would not be a problem to grow them again on another island elsewhere in the world. And if they had been problems here, then the next time they would solve those problems. That was how progress occurred, by solving problems. As he thought about it, he concluded that Wu was not really the man for the job. Wu had obviously been sloppy, too casual with his great undertaking, and Wu had been too preoccupied with the idea of making improvements. Instead of making dinosaurs, he had wanted to improve on them. Hammond suspected darkly that was the reason for the downfall of the park. Wu was the reason. He then goes on to blame some of his other workers, and basically everyone but himself. And as the scene goes on, we'll sort of see where this goes. I'm gonna skip forward quite a bit. At this point, Hammond has taken a tumble down the hill and broken his ankle, and he's trying to get back up so he can get back to his bungalow. He heard a squeaking, then a chittering sound. Some kind of small birds hopping in the undergrowth. He'd been hearing small animals all afternoon. There were all kinds of things out here. Rats, possums, snakes. The squeaking got louder, and small bits of earth rolled down the hillside past him. Something was coming. He saw a dark green animal hopping down the hill towards him, and another, and another. Compies, he thought with a chill. Scavengers. The compies don't look dangerous. They were about as big as chickens, and they moved up and down in little nervous jerks, like chickens. But he knew they were poisonous. Their bites had a slow-acting poison that they used to kill crippled animals. Crippled animals, he thought, frowning. The first of the compies perched on the hillside, staring at him. It stayed about 5 feet away, beyond his reach, and they just watched him. Others came down soon after, and they stood in a row, watching. They hopped up and down and chittered, and waved their little clawed hands. "Shoo! Get out!" he said, and threw a rock. The compies backed away, but only a foot or two. They weren't afraid. They seemed to know he couldn't hurt them. Angrily, Hammond tore a branch from a tree and swiped at them with it. The compies dodged, nipped at the leaves, squeaked happily. They seemed to think he was playing a game. He thought again about the poison. He remembered that one of the animal handlers had been bitten by a compy in a cage. The handler had said the poison was like a narcotic. Peaceful, dreamy. No pain. You just wanted to go to sleep. The hell with that, he thought. Hammond picked up a rock, aimed carefully, and threw it, striking one compy flat in its chest. The little animal shrieked in alarm as it was knocked backwards and rolled over its tail. The other animals immediately backed away. Better. Hammond turned away, started to climb the hill once more. Holding branches in his hand, he hopped on his left leg, feeling the ache in his thigh. He had not gone more than 10 feet when one of the compies jumped onto his back. He flung his arm wildly, knocking the animal away, but lost his balance and slid back down the hillside. As he came to a stop, a second compy sprang forward and took a tiny nip from his hand. He looked with horror, seeing the blood flow over his fingers. He turned and began to scramble up the hillside again. Another compy jumped onto his shoulder, and he felt a brief pain as it bit the back of his neck. He shrieked and smacked the animal away. He turned his face to the animals, breathing hard, and they stood all around him, hopping up and down, cocking their heads, watching him. From the bite on his neck, he felt warmth flow through his shoulders, down his spine. Lying on his back on the hillside, he began to feel strangely relaxed, detached from himself. But he realized that nothing was wrong. No error had been made. Malcolm was quite incorrect in his analysis. Hammond lay very still, as if he was a child in its crib, and he felt wonderfully peaceful. When the next compy came up and bit his ankle, he made only a half-hearted effort to kick it away. The little animals edged closer. Soon they were chittering all around him, like excited birds. He raised his head as another compy jumped onto his chest. The animal, surprisingly light and delicate. Hammond felt only a slight pain, very slight, as the compy bent to chew his neck. Yeah. So, Hammond, that's the old man, literally dies in this story at the hands of his own animals. And that creates a pretty crazy parallel to that of the case of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. Destroyed by your own creations. And this is really where the major difference comes in, though, is the difference in how Hammond is characterized versus the Professor. The Professor is doing this purely for knowledge and the altruistic idea of creating a paradise. Hammond, however, at least particularly in the book, has a very different perspective. He is very much the shrewd businessman in this version of the story. That line that his lawyer says in the movie about we could charge 10 grand a day for this park, he says that in the book. So it's very clear what the author, Michael Crichton, is trying to get at with this story, is that this type of technology is super dangerous, especially in the hands of venture capitalists with insufficient government oversight. In fact, the setting is a very important aspect. The fact that Hammond chose an island off the coast of Costa Rica, is explicitly stated in the text at multiple times to be to avoid the US government and any potential regulations. He operated in complete secrecy with no one telling him whether or not what he was doing was dangerous. And it came to bite him. Quite literally. In fact, the book's introduction really does sell that. The book opens with a fictional introduction, sort of similar to the ones that are written in non-fiction books. And there's one standout quote from it that I want to read. "The work is uncontrolled. No one supervises it. No federal laws regulate it. There is no coherent government policy in America or anywhere else in the world. And because the products of biotechnology range from drugs to farm crops to artificial snow, an intelligent policy is difficult. But most disturbing is the fact that no watchdogs are found among scientists themselves. It is remarkable that nearly every scientist in genetics research is also engaged in the commerce of biotechnology. There is no detached observers. Everybody has a stake." And ultimately, that's the takeaway from this. This is the problem, is that we think we have the ability to control these creatures, or we don't think about the negative externalities. Scarlet and Violet makes a huge deal over the fact that if the Paradox Pokemon are let out, they could disrupt the natural ecosystems. This is a very real thing called invasive species, and many countries, particularly island nations, have a problem with animals being imported from other parts of the world and then disrupting the existing relationship between predators and prey, to the point where it might have detrimental effects to everything living on the island. But I'm not going to get too deep into that because let's just say this particular case is relevant to a potential video that I am at least considering doing in the future. I think some of you know which one that might be. But beyond that is that the book points out that animals escape from zoos. The idea that you could have complete control and prevent anything from getting out is ridiculous. And you could do all these guards, all these safety checks, but it will never succeed 100% of the time. Nothing succeeds 100% of the time. And all it takes is one flaw, one disgruntled employee, one person not doing their job up to par to derail the entire thing. We sometimes see the potential profit for a new business venture and don't think that if it goes wrong, the effects could be devastating. And that is the point of these stories, is that we have a responsibility to society and our environment to not needlessly endanger it. And messing with stuff like this has the potential to do it. Thanks for watching. So yeah, this was maybe a bit more of an unorthodox video for this channel, but I've been wanting to do this one for a while, like actually since New Year's. It's just a case of where I wanted to go through and actually reread the book first, which I think helped a lot in terms of giving me more insight, because the movie just really doesn't do that. Like, it's still great, but like, I really am glad I went to read the book again. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this in the future. Potentially content about a Pokemon game that might involve invasive species. Wink, wink, wink. You know which one I'm talking about. I talked about it in my last video. Also, if you would like to support this channel financially, you can do that either on my Patreon or just by becoming a member of the channel. But with that, I will see you guys in the next video.